So I brought the image into Photoshop, and there's a set of questions that I always ask myself prior to starting retouch. It kind of goes along with the composition. We talked about that in the prerequisite, about leading the eye through the photograph from one place to another, making it linger so we have some sense of drama or story within the picture. Now we can help that quite a bit in Photoshop, and we do that by enhancing the places in the photograph where we want the eye to go to, and maybe pushing down or toning down the areas we don't want the eye to go to. We already done some of this without me really mentioning it in depth, and that was pushing back color. Color get a lot of attention in photographs, and we talked about that in color theory. Here in Photoshop, I already toned back the yellow so that this didn't become all about the train car in the background. We want the focus to be on the guy. So I ask myself, where do the focus want to be in the picture, and what can I do to enhance it? The second part is more an intangible component, and it's more emotional. What do I want this picture to feel like? What is the color tonality of that feeling? And also, what is the story of the picture? This obviously is a story of a guy traveling, going places. Now, this is a train car standing still and there's no motion here. So how do I enhance that? You're going to enhance that, like you saw in the finished piece, by making some motion blur to the background cart. Gives it an idea of this cart going somewhere and this guy going somewhere instantly. And then there's the focus part, and this is where we're going to start. The first layer, pretty much to everything I do, is a contrast layer. And I never really use the contrast tool. I always go for the curves. I'm going to show you something real quick. And this is what I learned way back when it comes to using curves rather than a lot of these other tools. Here's our levels. If I take this level here to increase the contrast, I would push this down till it starts looking good. Now, what happens here is that this number here is 255 to 0, and that represents the 255 shades of gray in a grayscale. So that's where that number comes from. At 255, you have a full scale. So when you start cropping this out or pushing this down, you actually take away these pixels in the highlights. Yes, you can move the slider here, which is better, but you never really want to move this. Then you crop away or clip away these pixels above this point, and you see it here in the windows that this is not something we want to do. So early on in my career, I learned this way and got told to never use levels and use curves. Curves is a lot better in that way as we push and pull on this graph to create our contrast. So this will be my first layer, and it kind of comes into an S. That's how you work with contrast in the curve tool. So we push it down to increase the blacks, and we push this up to increase the highlights. So I always explore this as layer number 1. So we're going to just do a little bit here and maybe a tiny bit more right in there till we feel good about the contrast. Now, I don't really look at these areas. I look overall to make sure that it has the right pop in the tonality. We already increased some of this contrast in Capture One, and I just want to say a lot of this stuff is better done in the raw process than it is in Photoshop. So I try to just use the few tools I showed you in Capture to do that prior to process, and coming into Photoshop, some of this work is already done. All right, I'm going to fine tune this a little bit more. There. I think that's a pretty good start. Now, this story is obviously about the guy, and where our eye is going right now is in this quadrant where we have all these highlights, and not so much on the face. So let's work on that. So this will be the second way to use our contrast tool. In some ways, it will be to dodge and in other times burn when we select an area, use the same contrast curve to only affect certain places. So we're going to make his face brighter and give it some contrast, but we're only going to do it regionalized. So I want to talk a little bit about that before I move on. There are so many different ways to do things in Photoshop, and I can only show you the way that works for me. If you have a better way of doing this, I think you should use the way that you're used to. Use the way that will get you quickest to the result you want. You don't have to change your ways because I do it a certain way. So many ways to get to the same place in Photoshop. So instead of focusing so much on the tools and what I actually do, I think you should focus on the result of what I do. So if you want to set color and the color wheel is your favorite, use your color wheel. I just want you to ask yourself the right questions to get to a place where you feel really good about your pictures. So this is my process. If you have other tools, please feel free to use them for sure. So we're going to use our brush tool. I'm going to click here. I'm going to use this a lot through this whole process. This is our quick mask tool, and it allows us to make a selection pretty quick using our brushes. So nothing is going to be painted on here. We will get a temporary mask that we can turn into a selection in a minute. So we're just going to start painting in here a little bit, and what we see is that we get a red color where we do this. So I'm going to just brush around here a tiny bit like this. And maybe I went too far. For a second there I thought, oh, maybe I'll just give it some space around, but let's try to just keep it right on his face. I'm just going to brighten that up. Again, when that's done, we come out of the quick mask tool. We're going to invert our selection, which is Command-Shift-I. We had the exterior here selected. Now we have the interior of the face. Come in here. Again, curves. I'm just going to brighten that up. Just like that. Maybe let's try to push this a bit and see if we could bring some real good juice in there. Get a lot of contrast. So again, to bring depth and darkness into the shadows, we pull down on this S-curve that we're creating. And to increase the highlights, we push it up a bit. So let me see, maybe I'm pushing it too far, right about there. So now you see that we have way more attention brought to our guy's face. Now, the mask is a little sloppy. It highlights right around here too, which we can live with actually in this case. I don't mind masks bleeding in the areas around if it's appropriate, but we're going to come in here and fine tune this mask a little bit. We're going to select it. Going to take our brush tool and make it smaller. Then we're going to hit backslash, and that will show us the mask that we have. It will give us the mask we have in red, which will allow me then to come in with a brush and we can fine tune it a little bit. I'm going to use our eraser first and make sure that the selection that we're making hits all the places. So this is just a soft brush where I'm erasing to see more, and when I use the brush, I'm painting in to see less. So we're seeing what is inside or not with the red, and then we're not seeing what's underneath the red. So I'm just going to fine tune this a little bit. Again, if it bleeds out, I don't think anyone will see it. And it's kind of nice sometimes that we do have masks that doesn't have crisp edges, but they bleed around. So here we are. Looking at this close up, we're at 66.7%. There he is. I think we're going to sharpen this guy a tiny bit. Feels like he can need it right in here and in his beard. So we're going to double click on our background. Layer 0 is okay. We could have renamed it there. And we're going to duplicate it. Again, there's several ways to do this, right? We could have just put the sharpening on a smart layer, but I like to sharpen on this. And then I can go in between. So if I want to sharpen the face, I don't have to sharpen the background. So we come up here, filter, sharpen, unsharp mask. And this seems a little gritty, so we're going to come down. I usually live between 30 and 60, 65, and we'll do it right about there. Let's see. I think that adds some good crispness to his face. Now, just mentioned that I could do this selective sharpening if I wanted to. In that case, we would just add a layer mask to this area, or to this top sharpened layer. You could fill it with black, which is Option and delete, and it will fill with this background color, and Command delete is to fill it with white. Now it's obviously white already, so we don't need to worry about that. We're going to fill it with black, Option delete. Now we have a mask and there's no sharpening anywhere, and I can come in and then paint backward slash so I can see where I'm painting, and we can just sharpen up his face only. So why, you ask, am I doing this? And it's the same purpose for both really. I'm adding sharpness to where I want the eye to go, and I'm adding highlights to where I want the eye to go. So now we have a larger and better chance in focusing on our face of our talent, who is really the story of this, rather than looking elsewhere. So now we beautifully sharpened and highlighted our face of our talent. I'm a big fan of naming my layers because this is going to get messy. Not on this file, but later on. And there's always a good habit to have. So we can do for now, since we didn't rename the bottom layer, we just go layer 0 sharp. And we call this for contrast. And we call this top layer for face contrast. I have to apologize if you think it's too much to watch me name these layers, but later on when we get into this really heavy multi-layered files, we will never be able to go through this quickly without knowing and seeing these layers and what they're named. So it's useful to start this process right away. So now that we have brought this highlight on, I spend a lot of time zooming in and out of pictures just to sort of reassess where the picture is at. So we're going to zoom out and just get a sense of where we feel. And now to me, the eye goes way quicker towards the face than it used to. So let's just do this. This is where we started. This is where we are now. All right, so I still want to bring more attention to this area. So we're going to try to brighten this up even more. So yes, we did an overall of the face. Now we're going to go even tighter and do a second one, just highlighting this area right here. So again, we come to our layer mask. We're going to come to our brush. And again, there's so many ways to do this, but this is sort of my process. I come in here and I'll just try it in here a little bit. We can adjust this as we go along, which is the beauty of this. Again, I exit the layer mask. I do Command-Shift-I for inversing my selection. And then we have the face selected, come to the curves, and we're going to pull that up a tiny bit more, just like that. And then down on the contrast so that we don't lose the blacks in the area that we want to highlight. Right in there. Starting to feel a lot better to me. A little heavy on the tone. You see his face is getting a little red. So that's going to lead us into the second tool really that I use. For now, we have only used curves to add contrast and then add highlights where we want them to be. So I'm going to call this for chin contrast maybe. And we're going to come into hue saturation. I'm going maybe a little quick here for some, but these are the tools that you have that creates layers. So layer groups is right here, copying layers is right here, deleting a layer is here. And here we have all the different tools we have to shape the layers and give them tone. This is a layer mask, and here we have different effects on effect layers. So if you want to dive into these parts, there's beautiful tutorials out there from RGG and other places that will give you an introduction to Photoshop. This is not a great introduction to Photoshop. It's really just an introduction to the tools that I use so that we don't go straight into these massive composites. And I'll give you sort of this run up really to get our process started. So in hue saturation, we just want to pull down the saturation a tiny bit, just so that it doesn't feel unreal in the brightness of his face. So this is with and this is without. Feels pretty good to me. There's a few things that I like to do to my pictures, and we're going to take you guys through those elements right now. So there's a few things that I always like to do to my pictures, and it has to do with my favorite color, which is a warm yellow. I don't know why, but pretty much every picture that I have either has a warm yellow to it in the highlights, more a creamy tone, or it goes the opposite way. And I don't know what that is, but I'm innately drawn to that. So we're going to apply some of that tone into the highlights. We're going to come again into curves, and this is maybe the third tool that I use, which is color. Curves is amazing for color as well. it's not as obvious because you're pulling on a line and you have to work on the 3 different color layers. It's RGB, which we use for contrast. Now we're going to use this pull down menu and get into the red, greens, and blues. And this is truly how I work all my colors in Photoshop. Again, there's so many ways to set color. There truly is, and this is not maybe the preferred way because you got to have an understanding of how red works, how green works, and blue works. But I feel really passionate about this. You have infinitely more control using this tool than a lot of the others. So this is my process. Curves is being used for contrast. It's being used for dodge and burn in selective areas, and it's being used for color. So we're going to dive into this for now, just simply showing you how it's done. You're going to go to the blue tone, and opposite of blue is yellow. So if you pull it up, you get blue. If you pull it down, you get yellow. And these are the extremes, obviously. You're going to pull on the top anchor point here. And what it's going to do when we pull this down is to make everything above this line. We talked about the 255 or 254 shades of gray. Everything on the scale here above it will be yellow. And as we pull this anchor down, more and more pixels will be yellow. And obviously we come down here and it's all an extreme. But we want to just pull down a little bit on it, just to give it a tiny bit of yellow tone to the highlight. And as we do this, you see that this area right here, which was really bright white, and the shirt that gets a lot of attention, starts to get a little tone to it. I want to mention another thing. When we talked about composition, where does our eye go? Where do we lead the eye? Now, it's in this area here, which is the brightest point, into his face and his beard, which is the brightest point, and down into his hand and his knee. So now we kind of created a little bit of a triangle here where the eye can travel within the photograph. Now, still going to work on these highlights a tiny bit. So you're going to come up here to RGB. And let me see, if you just pull down the highlights a tiny bit. Even better in here. Now, doesn't look so great in here now, does it? So let's see if we could work on that. We'll pull this back up a tiny bit so it's not so extreme. And I'll show you before and after. Before and after. So we're going to come in here on our mask, going to click on that and then use the brush. And then we're going to take away the areas where we do not want this effect. Obviously this is affecting the whole picture, and I don't think we need it when it comes to his face right here. So by brightening this up, and maybe down in here a tiny bit too, we keep the highlights brighter, and now you see that we have maintained the brightness in his face and toned this down. And now the picture is starting to get more of a focus on the person rather than the outside. And we're going to keep on working on this. I wonder if we should maybe try another layer like this. I liked what I saw when his face got a little bit of that yellow tone, but we brushed that away. So now we're going to come back and do this again. Curves, come down into the blue, and then pull down the top anchor. Now again, we're affecting everything in yellow, bringing more yellow into the highlights. But now we're getting that yellow into the face. In this layer, we mask that out. Let me show you. So the yellow we added in here got masked out. So we come up here, we add another yellow. And this gives us a beautiful yellow overall in the photograph. And I think that will do it for the color tonality of this photograph. I feel pretty good about this. So again, we have done a few things that will help us bring the eye to where the focus point is. We have sharpened it. We have added brightness and contrast to the face where we want the focus to go. And we've done so through making a mask and adding contrast using curves. Then we've gone into use saturation to tone down the color a little bit. What that does is, in this case, give us a more muted palette that I feel speaks well to the old styling, the old trains. That muted feel gives us a sense of nostalgia. On top of that, the yellow, which also works on the nostalgia and the notion of a different time when this travel might have taken place. So that's where we are at. Then initially, I talked about motion. this picture feels static for the story we want to tell. This guy's not going anywhere. So what we want to do is to create some motion blur to the train and see if we can create some energy and movement to this photograph. So we're going to come down in here. Just going to select the top part. There's no reason to select everything because only the parts outside the windows will be moving. So we're going to do a Command copy, and we're going to go do a Command Shift paste, and then we're going to add a little bit of motion blur. For now, I'm going to turn off this sharpening layer on the face. As we're building upwards, we want to blur this, and his face will get blurred, and then we're going to mask that out. And at the end, we'll then add the sharpening with a proper mask. Now this is bleeding a bit out, but we don't want this layer to be on to confuse what we're doing with the motion blur and the masking of that. So we're going to add a mask. As we know that we don't want the interior of the cart to blur, we only want the exterior, so we have to mask out only the exteriors. So let's see. We select our layer, we come up to filters, blur, and the motion blur. In here, we have a sense of direction to our blur, and obviously we don't want it to go up and down. That just signify a really bumpy ride. So we're gonna go 0 on the angle, so it's a back and forth. So obviously it's confusing to look at the face here, but you just want to look at the background. This feels a little bit too much maybe. So the distance that's really quick. That's being on the subway in New York, which is what we don't want. It's a slower paced train, so why don't we try right in there, 65 maybe. All right, we're gonna hit OK. Now it's a matter of masking out the interior, so we only add the blur to the exterior. So let's start that process. We click our mask, and we just then slowly, I'm gonna do this rough for now. Now when it comes to selections, again, there's so many different ways to get this done. And I'm just using one of them, which is using the lasso tool. As we use the lasso tool, I hold down the Option key, which will allow me to get some anchor points in there. So now when I release my pen, I could just pull this along to here, and again up here, and it goes a little bit quicker than drawing this freehand. So now I selected all the interior parts. I'm going to take this mask we have right here and fill this with black so we don't see it. That's an Option Delete function, and boom, the interior became sharp. Obviously, there's some fine tuning to this. If you look at his face, it's sharp and then it's not sharp. There's these areas, sharp and not sharp. So we just got to go through this real quick so that we have an honest sense of where we need the blur and where we don't need the blur. Don't going to spend too much time on this because you're going to spend hours seeing me masking pictures. So for this, just introduction to how I use Photoshop and the tools. I think maybe we should even pass on it. So you get the idea. We're going to teach you masking later. It's just another tool to create the energy. I really just wanted to illustrate the idea and the point of asking yourself the questions of what do you want this to feel like? And that has been accomplished. We have created a blur that creates the story you're going somewhere and are traveling beyond that of just sitting static in a train. So it's about using Photoshop to express and extend the vision that we had when we took our photograph. So with that, I would say that this part is over. Don't mean to skimp on the finish of the masking, but we are going to be masking so many things. So this seems to be fairly simple in creating some fine-tuned masks around this and around that, and taking away the blur that comes into the edge right there and also into the hair and the face. So I would say mission accomplished. A quick sort of rundown. I want to do one more tool just to show it to you as we're doing the basics. I use curves for contrast. I use curves for dodge and burn, which in this case are dodging. I use hue saturation for the saturation of things. I use curves for color, using the 3 different RGBs channels. The last tool that I love to use is the color layer. Come in here to color. It's the color tool. We come here to solid color. That will give us a color picker and we can set our tones. Again, yellow is my family of tones, yellows and blues. So we start in here, which is some of my favorite tones, too bright, too saturated. So this in here is what I really love about color tonality in photographs. So we're going to set it there and hit OK. From the color here, solid color, we're going to set the mode up here to color. Come down here. So it only affects the color and not all these other ones, hue, saturation, and luminosity. So there it is. Now we have added a bunch of yellow color to it. Now we come up here in the opacity and we set this just about here. What this does is to give us an embedded color that affects highlights and shadows slightly different. And for me, it infuses an overall textural quality in color to the whole photograph. And it feels really, really good when you do composites. It seamlessly helps you blend the different elements in an untangible way. So often when I do composites and I can't quite get it to feel perfect, you add that color fill layer on top and it just sits in there, helps you blend the elements. So even though we didn't do any composites to this piece, here are the elements that I use for all the layers that I do in my composites. So you're going to see me do this over and over and over. And as we start blending pieces, we would use contrast and color and use saturation to make the pieces fit together. So that's my quick introduction to the tools that I use in Photoshop.